Let me just show you a little video clip. There's no audio hooked up to it, but I think you'll kind of get the gist of what's going on, and you can get some nice senses of things that I shot during this actual battle. And this is Special Forces trying to call in a JDAM, an airstrike. The bomb misses, and it hits a U.S. team. Special operations soldier trying to figure out, where did that bomb hit? And you hear on the radio, and this is the British SBS commandos coming out. You hear on this radio, like, "Are you guys okay? Are you guys okay?" Fog of war is a terminology that the military uses for this lack of understanding of these things that change in the battle, and you're trying to figure out what you should do and decisions you should make. But it's when you think of the person who's going to be the storyteller or the narrator of this particular event, the reporter, if it's short term or whatever it might be, they even know less. They step into a situation and they don't have any idea what's going on. Jumping up over the wall and you're looking at this fight down in the courtyard, it gave a whole different perspective to what was going on in the Battle of Kalajungi. And all kinds of stories have been told about this as a result. And I don't know if you remember, 3 days the battle lasted. They were able to, what we thought, they thought they killed all the prisoners. As they sent the Red Cross workers down into this building on day 4, down to the basement where they had all been held, they were shot going downstairs, and they realized, oh, we still have prisoners. So then they tried firing rockets into the windows and things like that. That didn't work. They tried burning them out. We poured, but they poured like diesel down into and then threw grenades in, tried to burn them all alive and try to burn them out. In the end, they just diverted the stream and flooded them out. And as the water rose to about 6 feet high, they started drowning there because most of them were wounded. And instead of a couple coming out, 86 prisoners came out of the fortress that Saturday morning, including John Walker Lind, who became famous for being the American Taliban, who's now serving 2 10-year back-to-back sentences. And then he'll be out actually in about 12 years, because it took him a while to go to court on it, or maybe 11 years. And speaking of the narrative and the storytelling, part of his sentence is not really interesting to see how this is enforced. He is unable to collect any royalties or make any money off his story. Because, this is America. In this culture, you do something messy or bad or provocative, and you just sell your story and make $1 million. And they couldn't get him on any other thing. The charge they got him on gave him the 2 10-year sentences, but they wanted to make sure that when he emerges from prison, he's at Fort Leavenworth, or the Leavenworth prison facility now, he doesn't write a book and become a millionaire off this experience. So we'll see how that goes as far as, because he'll certainly write a book, I'm sure, if not be the subject matter of 4 or 5 movies. But we'll see if the state, the government, can actually enforce this sort of royalty-free sort of storytelling. But Fog of War is incredibly important to telling the war story. Corey mentioned Operation Anaconda. One of the interesting events about Anaconda was this one day known as Roberts Ridge, where a Navy SEAL is struck. The helicopter comes in to land on a hill, Takur Gar. As they're coming in, the enemy sees it. They fire a rocket-propelled grenade. It hits the helicopter. The hydraulic breaks the hydraulic line. It spews all down the inside of the helicopter. They know they're under attack. They start to take off. Navy SEAL Roberts slips on it, shoots out, falls, and lands 20 feet in the snow below. Helicopter takes off. I'm in the valley on the north of the hill. We see the helicopter come over, and it's kind of beat up, and you can tell it's going to do a hard landing. It crashes behind us. No clue what was going on. I asked the commander guy next to me. I was with a conventional force commander with the Task Force Rakkasan. I said, that was a Special Forces helicopter. You can tell by a couple different characteristics on the helicopter. I said, what are they doing? They said, we have no idea what's going on. Helicopter crashes. They then do a head count and realize we're missing somebody. They hadn't even known that they lost Roberts at that point. Realizing they missed somebody, they called the command. Command tasked a Predator overhead to look around. And this is all classified, so there's multiple stories that come out of this, but apparently they could see a little firefight going on the top of the hill, and they assume it was Roberts trying to fight off these Taliban guys. In the end, of course, he's one man. He'd just fallen 20 feet out of the helicopter. His situational awareness wasn't good, and he's killed. The distressing part of this event comes when they send another helicopter in to, they thought, go to the bottom of the hill and march up. Well, communication gets crossed. They send the second helicopter in right to the exact same spot. The Taliban must have really thought this is the luckiest day of our jihad life, because they were not only ready, it was daylight. So they shot that helicopter down, just shot it down right there on top of the hill. And during the course of events, the Rangers pile out, 2 more shot as they exit. One of the mini gunners on the side, he's shot and killed immediately. An RPG just hits him in the vest, actually. It didn't explode, but they say the blunt force trauma of the RPG round just hitting him and knocking him back against the helicopter killed him. 7 more people die on that day. We're meanwhile in the bottom of the valley, which is only about 500 yards. And we can kind of know that stuff is going on, but we have no idea. So fog of war affected not only the military in this particular situation, where they actually sent their helicopter to the wrong place and got a second one shot down. It also, when I came out of that, we were trying to tell the story, and there were so many stories about Roberts Ridge that came up immediately in the press, but it's taken books and a lot of research and a few movies, documentaries on Nat Geo, to actually retell that story as more information has been available and more data comes out. So the storytelling that goes on is shaped, again, by so many different factors. I guess they could talk about these kind of things, these fog of war issues, for a long time. The one thing I want to talk about, let me just shift to risk. These numbers, Iraq, 230 journalists killed. That makes it a more costly war in terms of media than Vietnam. We did not suffer 230 media casualties during the entire length of the Vietnam conflict. There hasn't been as many in Afghanistan. I need to update it for 2011. But look at these figures. Afghanistan by year. We had 9 killed in 2001 and 0 killed 2002 to 2005. The first thing I want to say is it's dangerous to cover war. But the second thing I want to ask is I want to bring up is actually a question. Why were so many killed in 2001 and none killed for the next 4 years? Any ideas? Okay, that is absolutely true. We scaled down a lot of the soldiers from 2003 to about 2005. We had less than right around 10,000 U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. That is correct. However, you got to remember, in the early part of in 2001, that only represents 3 months: October, November, and December. And it really only represented a handful of Marines at the Camp Rhino at Kandahar Air Base, guarding the base, and a bunch of Special Forces soldiers. We only had about 200 or 300 soldiers on the ground. We had a lot of media on the ground there, but they did follow. The reason this changed is, of these 9, 6 were killed trying to get to Afghanistan. 3 were killed driving in from Tajikistan, just trying to get to the fight in Kunduz. And 3 were killed trying to get to Kabul from Pakistan, coming across the road, just killed. Political banditry, don't know, but they couldn't get there. So 6 out of the 9 were killed just trying to get there. Somebody in the U.S. Army at CFLIC, I can never remember the acronym, Land Component Command in Kuwait, realized that if we're going to get our story told, in other words, U.S. audience, we need to be able to help our media people, Western media, get in and tell that story. And in February of 2002, the Department of Defense authorized military airlift for all media through Kuwaiti International. Basically, they took Kuwaiti International Airport, and they split it down the middle. There was a civilian side and a military side. And if you wanted to embed, if you wanted to get downrange to Afghanistan, all you had to do was call Central Command, go through the public affairs office, fill out the manifest, do all the paperwork, do the visa, et cetera, et cetera. You could fly into Kuwait City. You're always told, go to the Sheraton or the Hilton or whatever, but have your cell phone. And shortly after you arrive, a public affairs officer from CFLIC would call you. You would then make arrangements to meet, and they would drive you back to the military side of Kuwait International and put you on a C-130 or C-17 or whatever and get you down to Afghanistan. This was a big effort by the Department of Defense to actually make sure that these stories were being told, but being told from reporters that shared our same values. In other words, Western reporters. It wasn't just for U.S., it was Canadians, the French, the Brits, basically Indians. Everybody was there telling these stories using military airlift. This is a huge move to mitigate risk. Another thing another piece of information that I thought was interesting, I just saw recently that they say that embedded versus non-embedded, for every 1 embedded media killed, 18 non-embedded media were killed. Now, again, I didn't do the study, But those, certainly it's high. It's high. I don't know if it's 18-1, but that's a very substantial number. Now, some media will never embed with U.S. forces because they think their story will be controlled. They don't want to tell a U.S. soldier perspective. They want to be on the ground with the Iraqis or the Afghans, and that's great. But I'm just saying this is a huge mitigator of risk, but it also shapes the kind of story you can tell. For instance, I was with 3-7 Marines in OIF 1, and the unit I was with was getting attacked on the right flank all day long along this one area. So these combined these CAT teams, they call them, would go beyond the flanks, and they actually saw this vehicle coming over, and they lit it up, destroyed the vehicle, not good kill, and we moved on. 3 days later, ITN News out of the UK said, we're missing our crew, and this is what they were driving. And then everybody realized we just blew that crew up 2 days ago. They weren't embedded. It was just an accident, one of those things. We had to send a group back to see, and sure enough, the ITN crew, all four were dead. Actually, their bodies had already been removed, but it was they never recovered 3 of the 4 bodies, but they were killed. It was a very dangerous business covering the wars. So again, these stories are shaped by so many different things. They're shaped by just location. They're shaped by fog. They're shaped by that. These are what I call additional motivations. Bias. This is one of the funniest stories of the war for me. I'm sitting here. That's me. That's Alex Perry from Time Magazine. His name is Colin from Newsweek, and Damien from French Channel 2. We're in Mazar-i-Sharif in November, and these are 2 of the Tajik commander Ostad Ata's guys. And what's the first thing that stands out about Time and Newsweek? The relationship. It's competitive, right? They're both weeklies. They both have the same, they're fighting for the same audience, a weekly magazine. Well, Colin was unfortunately arrived a few days late, so he didn't really know what was going on. Not that we knew what was going on, but he knew even less. Well, he kept eavesdropping on Alex's conversations to the Time Magazine Bureau. And Alex got so mad that he started pretending to call Time and feeding him full of false information. And in the end, Colin submitted a report for Newsweek that was a lot different than the issue that Time put out. There was no conspiracy to mislead the American people. There was no conspiracy to skew events toward one political entity or another or way of thinking. This is just, Time Magazine said, there's no way Newsweek's going to beat me in the story. And that was it. Now, Colin got his revenge because Alex and I, we've been there for a week. All my equipment was down. It was really dusty. A lot of bombs were falling. Nothing worked. My sat phone didn't work. My camera, nothing worked. So I thought, crud, I got to go out to Uzbekistan and get new equipment. We left on that Saturday morning, drove up to the Amudari, and we're going to cross into Uzbekistan. As we were driving out, Colin stays with Damien because the French paratroopers had just arrived at the airport. They took control of the airport in Mazar-i-Sharif. So Damien's like, the French, we take care of each other. So he just went, and they did. They just totally took care of him and said, yeah, come with us. And he just bunked with them and just lived with the French paratroopers. Colin accompanied him. The 86 prisoners come out, and Colin is the only one to get the story of John Walker Lynn, the American Taliban. So in the end, he trumps Alex because we're sitting at the border at the Amudari trying to get across into Uzbekistan. And 2 weeks later, he's on David Letterman because he was the one that identified John Walker Lynn, the American Taliban, and did the reporting for him. So Newsweek they didn't exactly get the story, the first week's story, but the second week's story was amazing. Storytelling process. These things all get in the way of storytelling. I say accurate storytelling. Finally, let me talk a little bit about the points of friction. The media and the military, they just have different mandates. And if you're downrange, you'll see a lot of things where the military would rather you covered it in this way or didn't cover it, or they have time to get their information out. And I get that. But it's impossible today in today's media environment. And so they wrote the COIN manual, FM 3-24. General Petraeus was here. I don't know if anybody here had a chance to go see him when he was here in the lecture last year. General Petraeus and General Mattis from the Marine Corps, they were the primary architects of what FM 3-24, what they call the counterinsurgency manual. And in that, they tell the Army to rethink about how you deal with the media. And the bottom line is, the media is going to tell a story with or without you. These stories will be told. So are you going to have any positive influence? I mean, if you think about it, the military, they feel like they're always the brunt of negative reporting. They don't like casualties reported. You know how hard I had to look for this picture of this downed Marine? And the only reason I looked for it is because it became a big issue about a reporter who publicized pictures of this killed Marine. So I wanted to see for myself what all the issue was about. The military likes to control the battle space. In other words, it's very easy if you're this force and the enemy's this force and there's nothing in between you, so you can just practice total war on them and just annihilate them. The fact of the matter is, there's not an enemy in the world that I think is dumb enough at this point to drive out to a desert where there is nobody else and meet the U.S. Army head on. They're just not going to do it because they know they will live about 15 minutes, and that's it. It'll be over. Instead, you stay in the cities and you fight an insurgency conflict from the cities where you put yourself with civilians, with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, with the media, and all these other people in there, and you fight the war there where it's ugly, where it's dirty, and where it's part of the population. You're fighting a population-centric environment, and they know that. So the military has come a long way. They know they can't really control the battle space anymore. They don't try to control it as much as they try to manage it. And if you go to the National Training Center at Fort Polk, or down at, the National Training Center, and the other one up at Fort Irwin, California. We have one in California, one in Fort Polk, Louisiana. You'll see these soldiers train, and they're training with, and they'll have all these role players just go out there, and there'll be media, there'll be NGOs, there'll be women, just to make sure they know they have to fight this conflict with everybody on the battlefield. And how do you fight it? You can't just kill everybody. We can do with that. It's not exactly, you're not going to win any long-term victories by killing everybody. So they have to work around that. OPSEC, time sensitive. What's really interesting to see since the embed in 2003 is that the military has realized that it pays to share information with media. And so in many cases, what I'll say is, let me back up, is in the last 10 years, you've seen a complete shift in thinking from what I honestly believe from the military, that they're more about sharing stories and making sure their stories told. 10 years ago, it was more like a no-comment generation. We can pool the media, keep them to the back. They can tell their story, but they have to work around our guidelines. Well, it doesn't work that well anymore for reasons which we'll talk about in a second. But those days are done. So what they've done is they've shared information. In fact, of the 660 media that were embedded with the Marines and the Army in Iraq and the deserts of Kuwait that pushed forward, I would say that all of them, most of them, if not all of them, had access to classified information. All of them, on a daily basis. And what I mean is, the intelligence officer, the S2, would give a brief, and he would say, we're going to attack here tomorrow. Here's the battle plan. That's all OPSEC. You never broadcast where you're going to attack. You never tell about their strength of numbers. As soon as the mission's done, it's history. It's not OPSEC. These are time-sensitive issues. These aren't long-term, like classified issues that need to be classified forever and ever. Of the 660 media that were doing that, I can only think of 2 breaches in that trust. One was a junior CNN reporter who was from the regimental command that I was near, and he was whisked away by the MPs. The second was Geraldo. Yeah, exactly. Geraldo came out of Colonel Lennington's tent after getting the pre-attack plan. Everything Geraldo knew at that moment was classified because the attack hadn't happened yet. He went outside and he drew the plan in the sand on live Fox. He was taken out of theater, but Geraldo is Geraldo. And so did his ratings go down? No. Did people stop watching him? No. A couple weeks later, he was on Jay Leno, just going, silly mistake. His ratings actually went up over the event. So I'm not saying media is fair. The junior CNN gets canned, and rightfully should have, because my commander that we were with said, I'm going to let you in on everything, but don't blow it, okay? And everybody understood. You just don't, there's a time when everything that's classified is not classified. But you'll see that sharing, I think, a lot. Now, and especially with media that are embedded, they get that chance to work with these commanders all the time. General Caldwell, I'm going to just talk 1 second about General Caldwell, who is now in Afghanistan. He was in charge of Army education for a while, and he was at Fort Leavenworth, the Command and General Staff College. And he, I think, had a really good idea about what was going on with the media and how stories were being covered. And I pulled this up from one of his speeches. He said, the public has a voracious appetite for the sensational, the graphic, and the shocking. Honestly, if you're leaving campus today and a crash occurs, a car crash, you're all going to look at it as you go by. Some of you might even slow down. Is there anybody here that will not look at a car accident as you go by? We all do. It's human nature. And it's not bad human nature. It's the same human nature that would cause some of us to actually stop if we're first on the scene, or it happens right in front of us, to be a first responder, to maybe help people. But knowing that, when you think about stories in the war, and the military has a big problem with what they call if it bleeds, it leads. That's because the media is serving a public, and they know what drives the public. It's like if you look at the Geraldo story, Celebrity Justice, those kind of programs like that, Lindsay Lohan going to jail for the whatever time now, this time around. You know what? Somebody's watching that stuff, or it wouldn't be broadcast. The ratings are high enough to keep advertising dollars in so that the media business, which is the exchange of information for money, continues. That's kind of how it is, and he recognized that. And finally, what I've seen in the military a lot when they come to work at the media is they're not as reactive. In other words, they try to get their story out sooner. It's called release authority. You want to be able to release your story sooner so that the media has more access to it. And we've seen that a lot. In fact, do you remember a couple months ago the helicopter that was shot down in Afghanistan? 30 U.S. Special Forces soldiers were killed. Soldiers, they were Navy SEALs, I guess. But who released that story? Does anyone remember who first released that story? Is President Karzai, which usually we're always fighting against our enemy telling a story, and we got to get a counter story. Here's our ally. Well, that's arguable. But here's President Karzai. And he releases the story first. He doesn't call the Department of Defense. He doesn't call anybody on our side and see if it's cleared. He releases the story. Now, he had good reason. There were 7 Afghan commandos on that helicopter, too, which I think we've already forgotten about. So they suffered 7, but we lost 30. He released that story, which forced the Department of Defense to really then release subsequent stories quickly after, so that a foreign head of state isn't telling a story about a downed U.S. helicopter with 30 of our guys on it. And so we had to release that story over and over. Commanders have, in other words, brigade commanders have given release authority down to battalion commanders. Battalion commanders have given it down to company commanders, and so on and so forth. I talked a little bit about bias. It's very complex. Stories are told all the time. You probably remember the runaway general, the story by Michael Hastings from Rolling Stone that basically sank General McChrystal. You know, he was basically removed. I mean, against Article 8, I think it's Article 88 in the Code of Conduct. I mean, you can't really do those things. So he had to be removed just by law. But, you might say that Michael Hastings, if you're a soldier, you're going to probably be careful what you say around Michael Hastings next time he comes into the area. Other reporters, they might have more free reign. I want to talk about the information revolution, but really what I want to talk about is, 2 things. Let me give 2 things. Information, these stories change regimes, and I'm going to give 2 examples. 1952, Abdul Nasser came to power in Egypt on what was known as the Free Officer Revolution. It was also known as the Transistor Revolution because he used the radio. And you think, that's not a revelation, that's easy. But you know what? The Arab nations at that time is basically an illiterate area where only maximum 20% of all Arabs in the Middle East could read. That's it. So he realized he could skip it, and he just went to the radio and broadcast his message, and he was really popular in the beginning. Let me just skip down to this one, satellite TV, BBC, and the rise of Al Jazeera. Right now, we just had Muammar Gaddafi fall. In Tunisia, they just voted in the first post-authoritarian regime vote. This is a couple days ago. Egypt, we know what's going on in Egypt. Syria is still up for grabs. This Arab Spring, which, by the way, is coined by a Westerner. It's not something the Arabs came up with themselves. I don't know who coined it in the West, but we coined it as a culture. Yes, it is a spring. They've thrown off these authoritarian regimes. You know who threw off those regimes and who's responsible for that? The storytelling of Al Jazeera. Now, no matter what you think about Al Jazeera, and there may have been social media to be the trigger, when Al Jazeera came online in 1996, I use the term come online, but when they started broadcasting in 1996, they started telling people and talking about things in the Middle East that meant something to people in the Middle East. Maggie here, is Maggie still down the hall? If you know Maggie from Egypt, ask her about Al Jazeera. She'll tell you Al Jazeera was like a breath of fresh air in Egypt because for the first time, people in Egypt could actually hear and discuss and think about things that everybody knew. I mean, if you listen to Egyptian state TV, Egyptian media, you'd think that it was like Switzerland. Everything's great, the air's clean, the water's beautiful. I mean, everything's wonderful. But everybody in Egypt knew that everything was falling apart. And Al Jazeera talked about things that meant something to people in their area. And the seeds of Arab Spring, in my opinion, and I strongly believe this, we could talk about this for 2 hours, was 1996. That was the beginning of the end for all these authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Yes, cell phone and the internet were the trigger, and you don't know how long it takes a revolution to occur, but Al Jazeera that was the beginning, and that's why Arab Spring occurred today. That's why it's occurring right now. And if you look at the blue, that's how important Al Jazeera is in the aggregate to these countries here. And all of these countries didn't like Al Jazeera for their storytelling. All of them. The Saudis hate Al Jazeera. The Egyptians hate Al Jazeera. Now, they really hate Al Jazeera now. In fact, when the uprising occurred, they killed an Al Jazeera camera crew. They burned all the offices. They destroyed all the equipment, and they drove them out of Cairo. I mean, if they targeted anybody or any one entity more, it was Al Jazeera. And I'm not sticking up for Al Jazeera like they're, a godsend. But you know what? They leveled the playing field. They told stories that meant something to that population, and as a result, people started listening, and it became a matter of public debate. And in the end, they couldn't withstand the flow of information. And when you think about storytelling, there must be something to this, because look at all the efforts that Iran, North Korea, and China still put up against a free and independent press. When I was in China last year, there was something that was being broadcast or coming out, a story on CNN that the Chinese were not happy about. I don't know how they do it, but in every hotel that I know of, because I talked to friends, CNN was off the air for 48 hours. Everything else worked fine in China, but CNN was not on the air during those 2 days, and they were broadcasting these stories that were not favorable to what the Chinese government considered to them. They just blocked it out. They just cut it out. So that story didn't exist in China at that particular time. The camera phone and the web has changed storytelling forever. You know, the web is full of lots of junk, but there's lots of interesting stuff out there too, and lots of relevant stuff. The hanging of Saddam Hussein, who shot that image? One of the guards, one of the Shiite guards at his hanging shot that with his crappy camera cell phone. Then he took the information, put it on the web, and gave it to everybody. All the networks ran with it. That story was made possible not by a news crew, not by a traditional storyteller. And if that's the one reason why the military has reacted, I think, and pushed more toward favorable relations with the media, it's this simple fact alone. You can't police camera phones and the internet. 50% of every Afghani, 50% of the Afghan population, Afghani, that's money, Afghans, they have a camera phone and they have access to the web. So if they're there to tell a story and something happens, there can be a story made out of it, whether there's a traditional news crew or not, whether there's a traditional storyteller or not. And that's it's completely changed. Muammar Gaddafi, the gruesome images of him being dragged out of the pipe, taken, looked like he was being sodomized with a knife or something for a little bit. That came out like 2 days ago. More tape's been released on that. And then he's killed. Did a news crew shoot that? No. This is citizen-driven media. This is the capability that all of us have in this room to become people who tell stories and can find a global audience for these stories. I'm not saying that anything you come across or report on would become a global story. I mean, it'd be great if it did, right? But every once in a while, a story will stick. The stoning of the Yazidi girl in Iraq about 4 years ago, stoned to death because she had a relationship with an Arab in her town. Who stoned her and who filmed it? Her cousins and brothers and father, all the males in her family stoned her to death and filmed it on their camera cell phones. And then they leaked it. And then it leaked, or someone spread it one too many times, and it went global. And then it was taken off the air. It was just a little too gruesome for mainstream reporting. But this story was told by the perpetrators. I mean, the environment has completely changed how we tell stories. I mean, you don't have to, we've kind of gone through this. I mean, it's just completely upended everything. Journalists now can go right to their audiences and tell stories. You don't have to have a bureau. You can self-publish. The whole world has changed, and it's really changed. You know, look at Afghan media trends, which is sort of interesting. I could do a lot of work in Afghanistan. These numbers aren't as important necessarily the actual number, because they're based on different studies. Everybody studies it a little different, and their numbers change. But the trend is upward. It's becoming an information-full environment. What's remarkable about this is that current surveys still say that Afghans still suffer from what they call information insecurity. A splintered media landscape, especially along ethnic lines. Like Hazaras will believe, Hazara source. Uzbeks up in Balkh province will prefer to get their news from Balkh News and TV rather than a Pashtun station in Kandahar. That's not necessarily surprising. Let me just jump ahead because we're kind of running out of time. I wanted to talk a little bit more about Anaconda. I knew this would go by really fast. But is there any questions or comments? I mean, when I think about the modern war story today, it's governed by so many different factors, of course, location, fog of war, the media revolution. And in that process, I would honestly say that 7 out of 10 times of a story that I've followed or an event where I've followed multiple stories, most of the people out there telling stories are trying their best to get it right. But I always will say this. I always read anything about war, whether it's in the Washington Post, the New York Times, I don't care what magazine or what format, with a grain of salt, because it is so difficult to get all the facts right in the setting of war. It's a visceral experience, it's fast-moving, it's dangerous, and you only usually have 1 or 2 positions on the battlefield. And if you take any one episode like Operation Anaconda, there's a 2 or 3 dozen books on it, multiple films, and there's new information found in each one, and information that's contradictory to each other. Doesn't mean that they're all no good. They're not worth reading, not worth reviewing. Of course not. It just means that if you really want to know and understand and become an expert on this particular operation, you might want to read more and more of the work on it. Few of us will ever take the time to do that. What do they say? If you read 3 or 4 books on one topic, you become an expert. I mean, as far as the global population goes, if you take the time to read it, you'll see the differences. Anybody want to talk about anything? Want to bring up anything about covering war or war stories? I mean, it's sort of a shotgun approach, and we go on, but I know it's 10 to the hour. I mean, what do you guys think? When you watch the war coverage of the last 10 years, is it fair? Is it legitimate? Does nobody care? Yes, sir.
You talked a little bit about the bias. 7 out of 10 are really trying to do the right thing. When we saw some of the comments come out of Iraq from the soldiers, very, very different story than what we'd seen in the media. And then also knowing that a lot of these independent media sources through their own private internet are really doing it from a vested interest. They have an agenda. How does the general population, other than reading 100 books, come up with a reasonable source?
That's a good question. You know, I think that's a good question. I mean, one thing maybe I can tackle this question this way. I mean, how many here would think there's a difference between the way MSNBC reports and Fox? There's a difference, right? There's an obvious left-right bias between the two. Most of us have already figured out which one we want to listen to and subscribe to, sadly or not. We kind of tend to lean toward what we already think will speak more to us. I find that. I mean, in the early days, in February of 2002, VH1 showed up at Bagram. And more power to them. They were going to do a soldier diary series. But when the 10th Mountain Soldiers realized it was VH1, the Sergeant Major, Frank Grippi, I remember, he's like, VH1, no way. They can't talk to my soldiers. They're a 5th column. You know, it's like, no way, man. No way. VH1 actually was going to do, I thought, a pretty good job, but the bias was there from his side as well. And VH1, I'm sure, probably, might say it carries a countercultural bias. I don't know. That was his bias, that VH1 had that bias. So he forbid them to be in their tents, in their area. 101st Commanders, shrugged it off and said, whatever. So they went there and did a 101st story. Going back to what the soldier said at Riley, everything is skewed. But it's not necessarily skewed. It's just from the framework of how you see it. And I'm like, say 7 out of 10. There are those that will really maybe skew things along ideological lines. But like horse soldiers, I was there in 2 of those battles. I've read the book. Doug's a friend of mine. I helped him with it, the research. I can point to about 50 things that are wrong in the 2 battle scenarios that I did. From my perspective, I honestly this day go, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. You get all the information you can get. He also only talked about 1/3 of the special operations soldiers who participated, because that's all the special SOCOM would allow him to talk, you're clear to talk to these guys. So his book, which is still a good book, had to be written based on all the stuff that he could get. This group of soldiers, a few outsiders like myself, and anything that was public record. And in the end, he just pushed it all together and you try to push out what you think is the truth. And Doug wasn't there, and sometimes being there actually isn't, panacea. Sometimes you're there, you still have less idea than what went on. So I don't know. I think you just, it's hard. Your question is a good one, because I'm not sure if you can ever really know. I mean, but everybody comes in there with their own framework, and so you just got to who do you trust to listen to, But I do think you should look beyond that. What I think is interesting is, when I get up in the morning, I scan New York Times online. If it doesn't appeal to me, I don't read everything in the New York Times, but if it's about Afghanistan or Iraq, I'll read it because it means something to me. I'll go to Wall Street Journal, I'll go to BBC, and I'll go to Al Jazeera. And again, I'll just look for areas where they converge on a similar story, and then I'll read those collection of stories on that event. And I will say I believe one more than the other, but I realize they come from a different perspective. And sometimes you can get a more full version of that story that way. That's kind of how I read the news, which means what? I don't read as much broad news as I want to, but at least I feel like I have, 5 or 6 major players as far as the storytelling mechanism, what they're putting out to try to come up with something. That didn't answer your question at all, yeah.
Going back to your org chart of the Sorry, going back to your org chart, you mentioned how most of the reporters tend to be embedded with like the platoon levels or the squad-based levels. Do you think that's a concerted effort by the military command to sort of put them towards the front, or do you think that the military wants them diversified, spread out?
Actually, most want to be there because they want to cover the war. So few want to be at the brigade or division level because, well, some don't. There, a gentleman from Esquire came out to Anaconda, and he was about, I can't remember his name. He's a great writer, 70 years old. 70 years old. He had no interest at getting on a helicopter and getting dropped into the Shadcot Valley. And the Army obviously had no interest in sending a 70-year-old guy out there. But he did a fantastic story on Operation Anaconda just from interviews around the base, and the soldiers came and went. Most of us out there, a lot of us want to be there because you feel like that's where the action is going to be. The military split it up evenly all along the way. Some commanders are much more, I mean, I'll say this, generally, the Marines are way more favorable toward the media and storytellers than the Army. And I asked General Mattis about this. Why is the Marine Corps seem, at least from my perspective, so much more favorable to embedding media? They said, and he joked, he said, because we only get 6% of the DOD budget. So if we don't keep telling our story, there won't be a Marine Corps. Now, that's kind of an anecdotal aside, but I think there's something to that. But
I'm just curious how your experience doing the fog and friction embed was different than your Chechnya separatism jihad.
Okay, actually, what's interesting, well, hey, once we went to war after 9/11, I don't want to say it was great for me because obviously it wasn't great, but it was great for me because prior to that time, the U.S. wasn't really involved and I was covering Warsaw, being embedded. The term hadn't been thought of yet, but living with Chechen rebels, living with Abkhaz, living with the Peruvians in the Central Highlands, I mean, you're technically embedded. It was nice to then have our own army in the fight because, you know, I have relationships with a lot of these guys, so it was really easy for me to move along and to be with U.S. forces, just logistically a lot easier and a lot more friendly toward me. But overall, I guess the thing I learned in Chechnya, way up in the mountains there, is that at one point you can embed too deep. There's no safety net, and I felt like the safety net sort of came back a little bit with the U.S. Because I knew that if you were, media was injured, you know, and you're on an operation, you're injured, you're going to get airlifted out with everybody else. We're not just going to take the soldiers and throw the media guy on the street. That's nice. In Chechnya, you're so deep. You're way up there in the North Caucasus, and you're like, you know what, if anything happens, I don't even know if my mom will ever figure it out. The Russians were mad. They didn't want anybody from the West in there covering the war at all. The Chechens that I was with were nice enough, but I don't know what they would have done. I mean, didn't exactly, you know, give this letter to my, here's a letter from my mom or something like that. I mean, so you feel like it was a lot farther from home kind of thing. But the actual reporting was still kind of the same, I think, trying to tell the story. Does that answer the question a bit, or?
Yeah, it does. I mean, some of it, like with Basayev, it seemed, did you get like really personal experience with Basayev?
Yes, yeah.
How did that change your perspective on some of the Chechen actions, or like what their side of the story is?
Well, and the reason I was living with Basayev in his place is Vidino compound, and the reason I actually went and did the Chechen side of the story is I felt like the Chechen side was just not being told, that the Russians were trying to, Mexico is just rated the worst place in Latin America to be a journalist. But Russia, for a long time, has held that honor globally because if you're going to investigate corruption, the military or Chechnya, you're going to die. They're going to kill you in Russia. I mean, it's just all these journalists just keep getting killed. So I just felt like we wanted to tell the Chechen story. I had met Basayev and his group in Abkhazia 2 years earlier, so that helped a lot, smooth over and sort of, warm up to them. And that's the only way that was possible. But it did change the way I felt about the Chechens, because when you get in there, you realize that they had a legitimate beef as well. And when I think about the actions of Chechnya, the first war, in my opinion, is completely different than the second war. The first war was a national separatist conflict. I do believe that 100%. I don't think there was a jihad mandate. They talked a little bit about Islamic law, but it wasn't significant. And they were Muslim, by the way, but they were Sufis. Wahhabism, there were a few proponents of Wahhabism, but they just couldn't gain any traction. And Khattab, the Saudi himself, told us that he hated the Chechens. That the Chechens were the absolute worst Muslims he'd ever fought with. All they respected was violence and money, which made me laugh, because I'm like, of course, that's the kind of the Chechen way. I thought that was kind of funny. But by the Second War, Chechnya had really changed. I mean, a lot of that younger generation, a lot of the national separatists had all been killed, and I think it did leave room for sort of a jihadism. So it made me look at Chechnya not as one blanket, they're all bad or all good. It's just there's an evolution in that conflict. And what's left in Chechnya, the 200 or 300 soldiers or combatants fighting with Doku Umarov in the north, I'd say they're a little more radicalized than probably the soldiers, the combatants in 1994, 1995. So, yes, sir.
This is kind of a weird question, but do you speak all the languages there, or did you have interpreters with you the whole way?
I speak none of the languages there. There were times I had no interpreter, and those were almost kind of the scariest times. There was a 2-week period getting into Chechnya. That was tough. I had no interpreters. I could say a Russian word or this or that and the other, and I had a phrase book, and you get by. Somehow you just get by. Did I miss a lot of things? Actually, I did. And in the storytelling process, I always feared that I was missing out on lots of information to help me get a more accurate story. But most of the time, you end up with an interpreter to try to find one. In Chechnya, we found a Muslim from Guinea who had just come to the fight, and so he became our interpreter because he didn't have anything else to do, so we just paid him to be. That was the other good thing about serving with U.S. forces. It was kind of nice. At least we were all speaking the same language. But the interpreter thing is a big deal because one of the biggest problems that the U.S. military has faced from day one is we don't have enough people that speak those critical languages. We had one Arabic speaker in the entire battalion. We had 4 companies moving up through, the Marine Corps in our area. And we had Iraqis come to us day and night with grievances or information. And we all sat there and were like, gosh, do we feel stupid? We can't talk to anybody. We don't know how to, somebody then, an Iraqi would have a kid, because a lot of youth today are learning English, and they'd bring over like a 14-year-old boy, and then he'd be like their nephew, and he'd be the one that could speak to all of us about everything. But language, no. Bad American I am, I don't speak any foreign languages. I get by in Spanish. I actually do pretty well in Spanish, but I don't travel to that part of the world enough to put it to use as much as I should. So, hey, thank you very much for coming, and I'm here if you guys want to chat for a little bit longer. But again, thank you very much for coming to the lecture.